The Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, listen very carefully, it's going to be offensive, was raped. I selected that word, was raped by the church.
Whoa, what is the rabbi talking about? Is there any truth to his claim? Stick around and let's find out. Welcome to Faith and Doubt. I am R.L. Solberg. My friends call me Rob. And that man we just heard from is Tovia Singer. He's an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and he's the founder of Outreach Judaism. Personally, I find him to be a winsome and intelligent guy, and he's a great teacher. My Jewish friends would call him a mensch. I've watched a number of his teachings, and they always force me to dig deep, and I always learn new things, which I love. And that's exactly what he's done with the verse in Psalm 22 that we're going to be looking at today. Before we get rolling, if this is the kind of video that you enjoy, please do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, and make sure to hit that bell too so that you'll get notified when new content goes up. Rabbi Singer recognizes that Psalm 22 is a significant threat to his Jewish theology because of its overtly Christological properties. In a recent video, Rabbi Singer is building a case against the Christological interpretation of Psalm 22, and his argument is based on two factors. First, he challenges the accuracy of the English translation, and he provides a specific example we're going to unpack today, look at his claims, and see if they hold water. And second, the rabbi challenges the historical validity of the Septuagint, which is the earliest known translation of the Hebrew scriptures into any other language. I address his second challenge in detail in an article called Psalm 22, Pierced versus Lion, and I'm going to link to that article below. So the rabbi starts building his argument for the inaccuracy of the English translations with a controversial theory.
So the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, listen very carefully, it's going to be offensive, was raped. I selected that word, was raped by the church, not by these innocent, sweet Baptists from Arkansas. These young men and women have no idea this has been done. Was altered by the church in order to make it appear Christological. This was done in the 2nd century, a very long time ago.
So as an example of this raping, the rabbi points to Psalm 22, verse 16, which in your Jewish Bibles would be verse 17, and he reads out of the King James Version, which says this: "For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and feet." Now, according to Rabbi Singer, this English version that we just read is an intentional corruption of what the Hebrew actually says. So in Psalm 22, verse 16, the author, who's King David, is describing his enemies encircling him on all sides. And the rabbi points to the very end of this verse 16 where the corruption can be found. He says it's in the last three Hebrew words.
And now the last three words are critical. In Hebrew it says, Ko'ari yodai v'raglai. 3 words. Ko'ari. So what does that mean? Ari means a lion. So Ko'ari, the prefix, means like a lion. Yodai, my hands, v'raglai, my feet. Like a lion, all my enemies are at my hands, my feet.
So the rabbi is saying that at the end of verse 16, it doesn't really say they have pierced my hands and feet. In the original Hebrew, what it actually says is like a lion at my hands and feet. Wow, okay, so that's a pretty big difference. Pierced and lion are completely different terms. So which one's right? And how did we arrive at such different interpretations? The rabbi offers a theory.
What did the church do? It's mind-blowing. So imagine you've got these words like a lion that are at my hands and my feet. And you've got it on Microsoft Word. You selected the words like a lion, so you have now white letters on a blue background, okay? You tap your delete key, they disappear. And then you type in, they pierced. The text now is made to read, they pierced my hands and my feet.
Wow, okay, so that brings up a couple questions. First of all, what's the correct interpretation of this verse? And secondly, if the Hebrew phrase was changed, was it because of some sort of deceitful editing on the part of the Christian translators? Because if so, that would open up a huge can of worms. Now we'd have to look at all the verses in the Christian Old Testament and wonder if they're accurate. Before we get too far down the road, I think it's important that we take a broad survey of Psalm 22, verse 16, in some other English translations, because the rabbi really only looks at the King James version of this verse, and it offers no commentary or footnotes about the two different interpretations. Plus, the King James Version was published 409 years ago. So let's look at some more modern English translations. Now, the NIV uses the word pierced in the verse, but it includes a footnote that suggests that other manuscripts have this as like a lion. In the CSB, we see the same thing. The word pierced is used in the verse, and then there's a footnote referencing lion. And it's the same thing again in the ESV. We've got pierced in the verse and lion in the footnotes. And when we look at the New King James Version, which was published just 38 years ago, we see that they handle it the same way. They put pierced in the main verse, and then there's a footnote that mentions the alternate translation of like a lion. So what about the Jewish translations of this verse? Certainly the Jewish translators knew their Hebrew pretty well. How did they render this? It's interesting that the Orthodox Jewish Bible only mentions pierced, and it doesn't even bring up the lion alternative. And in the complete Jewish Bible, we see that they actually use the word or the phrase like a lion in the verse, and then they put the alternate translation of they pierced in the footnote. So the newer English translations all acknowledge this issue here with this verse. And that's good news. It tells us two things. First of all, Rabbi Singer's onto something. There does seem to be an issue here with the interpretation, and he's not just making this stuff up. Secondly, it turns out those sweet Baptists from Arkansas that the rabbi referenced actually do know that there are alternate translations of this verse. It's right there in their Bibles. Maybe this is why the rabbi only looks at the King James Version, because when we look at the other modern English translations, it kind of takes the air out of his conspiracy theories. So I did a little digging, and it turns out there's an interesting history behind this discrepancy here in verse 16. But it's not as sinister as the rabbi would suggest. He claims that the differences between these two interpretations are the result of a willful raping of the Hebrew text, and he specifically blames the translators of the King James Bible.
These guys are responsible. Those guys from Cambridge and Oxford, they knew what they were doing because they did know the Hebrew, and they deliberately abandoned the Hebrew in favor of the church fathers.
So remember, the rabbi even provided that clever Microsoft Word analogy in which he suggested that the Christian translators did something like highlighting the text that said like a lion, hitting the delete key so it was deleted, and then retyping they pierced in its place. But in actuality, and I find this kind of curious that the Hebrew-speaking Rabbi Singer didn't mention this at all in his video, the difference between the Hebrew phrase they pierced and like a lion is one letter. In Hebrew, the phrase like a lion is ka'ari, as the rabbi suggested, and the phrase in Hebrew for they pierced is ka'aru. These terms are nearly identical. The only difference is that the phrase ka'ari ends with the Hebrew letter yad, where the phrase ka'aru ends with the Hebrew letter vav. So using the good rabbi's Microsoft Word analogy, this looks a lot more like a typo than a deceitful edit. And it actually gets worse for the rabbi's case. Because the ancient translators were obviously not using computers, they were writing by hand. And it turns out that the difference between the Hebrew letters vav and yad is very slight. Look at this. The letters are very similar in shape. This is clearly not a case of somebody willfully highlighting text, deleting that text, and writing something completely different in its place. A much more accurate analogy would be to imagine someone handwriting the phrase, Jedediah Smith was a major. And then hundreds of years later, someone finds that handwritten document and they translate it as Jedediah Smith was a mayor. It's one tiny difference in one letter. Now, unfortunately, we can't check to see if the original letter was supposed to be a vav or a yad because we don't have access to the original Hebrew text anymore. Which is why, as we just saw, modern English translations note the fact that different manuscripts have different interpretations. So it seems to me much more plausible that what we see here in Psalm 22, verse 16, is a handwriting issue, not deceitful fraud. And when we step back and look at this verse in context, we actually find even more bad news for the rabbi's case. But before we get to that, I would love to know, what do you think about the fact that the difference between a vav and a yad is such a slight thing? Let me know in the comments below. So that still leaves us with the question, though, which interpretation is correct? And this is where things get really interesting. In a sense, whether we interpret it as they pierced or like a lion doesn't really matter. There are hundreds of other passages and prophecies that reveal that Yeshua is the Messiah that was spoken of in the Tanakh. The Christian case doesn't stand or fall based on Psalm 22, verse 16. But for the sake of argument, let's grant the rabbi that point and say, okay, the correct translation should be like a lion at my hands and feet. So here's my question for the good rabbi. What is the lion doing with the hands and the feet? Is he licking them? Is he sniffing at them? Way back in the 11th century, the legendary Jewish rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who's better known as Rashi, interpreted this phrase as follows: as though they are crushed in a lion's mouth. So it's a biting and a crushing that portrays great physical pain in the hands and the feet. And that's exactly what we see in the crucifixion of Jesus, whose hands and feet were nailed to the cross. Remember when he first appeared to his disciples after the resurrection? We read in Luke 24, "They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, 'Why are you troubled? And why did doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have.' When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet." And that's the thing about the rabbi's arguments against verse 16. All his conspiracy theories and his charges of fraud seem to be, as Shakespeare wrote, much ado about nothing. Because either way we translate Psalm 22, verse 16, whether it's "they pierced" or "like a lion," it foreshadows the specific suffering endured by Yeshua HaMashiach. So what did you think of this video? Give me a thumbs up, give me a thumbs down, put your comments below. Love to hear what you're thinking about it. I read them and reply to them all. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit that bell too so that you can be notified when new content goes up. Thanks for watching.